In the spring of 1861, as the United States fractured into civil war, a call for volunteers echoed across the North. In the small towns of eastern Ohio, that call was answered not by an individual, not by a handful of brothers, but by a dynasty. This is the story of a family that went to war, a family that would earn a name spoken with awe and reverence throughout the conflict. The Fighting McCooks. My name is Chris Mowry, and I am your host here on Stories of the Civil War, and I am from Northeast Ohio, where we are well familiar with the story of the McCooks. Their home still exists down in Carrollton. It's a museum. It's a place that you can go and visit, and I'm excited to be sharing their story with you today. When Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, the response from one Ohio family was so total, so overwhelming, that it remains almost without parallel in American military history. Two brothers, Daniel and John McCook, along with 13 of their sons, would serve the Union cause. In total, 15 men from a single family. Their commitment was so profound that 6 of them would rise to the rank of brigadier general or higher. This wasn't just service. It was a complete family mobilization, a vivid illustration of how the Civil War became a total war, demanding sacrifice from every corner of society. The patriarchs of this clan were 2 brothers who had settled in eastern Ohio back in 1826. The elder was Daniel McCook, a lawyer and a devout Presbyterian elder from the town of Carrollton. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, Daniel was 63 years old, an age when most men were considered long past their fighting days. But Daniel refused to stand aside, volunteering as a paymaster for the Union Army. His branch of the family, which included 9 sons who would serve, became known affectionately as the Tribe of Dan. The heart of this tribe was the family home, a handsome Federal-style brick house that Daniel had built on the Carrollton Public Square, a place that would see its sons march off to war, some never to return. Daniel's younger brother was Dr. John McCook, a physician from the nearby town of Steubenville. He was also in his 60s, but he volunteered his medical services to the Union Army without pay. His 5 sons, who all became officers, formed the Tribe of John. Together, these 2 tribes represented an astonishing cross-section of American life. These were lawyers, doctors, professional soldiers, chaplains, and students, ranging in age from their early teens to their 60s. But within this story of unified patriotism lies a stark and tragic contrast, a testament to really the random cruelty of war. The tribe of Dan, led by the patriarch who would himself fall in battle, would pay a terrible price, losing 4 of its own in the conflict. The tribe of John, despite serving in battles from Virginia to Florida, would see all 5 of its sons survive the war unscathed. It's a dramatic irony that hangs over their entire saga. A story of incredible valor defined by an equally incredible measure of sacrifice. The story of the McCooks' sacrifice begins not on a battlefield, but on the quiet academic grounds of Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. In the spring of 1861, 2 of Daniel McCook's youngest sons were students there, 17-year-old Charles Morris McCook and his 16-year-old brother John James McCook. A patriotic fervor was sweeping the campus. Students armed with wooden muskets practiced military drills in the nearby woods, their youthful enthusiasm a prelude to the grim reality that was to come. As his older brothers and cousins rushed to take up wartime posts, Charles was determined to join them. But his mother Martha was terrified at the prospect of sending all her sons into battle. She pleaded with Charles to stay, but his sense of duty was unshakable. A heart-wrenching compromise was struck between the two. Martha gave Charles her blessing to enlist in the 2nd Ohio Infantry, but on one condition, that his younger brother, John James, promised to remain in school and not join the army without her permission. It was a promise that would weigh heavily on the younger brother, leaving him behind at Kenyon, seething with impatience as the nation marched off to war. Just a few months later, on July 21st, 1861, the first great battle of the war erupted near Manassas, Virginia. At the First Battle of Bull Run, the naive belief in a short, glorious conflict would be shattered forever. Several of the McCooks were on or near the field that day. Colonel Alexander McCook, one of the older brothers and a West Point graduate, was commanding the 1st Ohio Infantry. Their father, Daniel Sr., had traveled down from Washington, where he was working, to watch what he expected would be a decisive Union victory. Instead, as the tide of battle turned into a rout, the 63-year-old lawyer found himself working as an impromptu nurse, tending to the horrific wounds of Union soldiers streaming back from the front. In the chaos, his son, Private Charles McCook, had a brief lunch with him before rushing back to rejoin his regiment, which had come under a sudden attack. As his father watched from the field hospital, Charles was cut off by troops of Confederate cavalry. They spotted the lone teenager and gave chase, demanding that he surrender. Charles stopped, turned, and drew his pistol. Accounts published just months after the battle described his defiant response. Facing the lead horseman, he calmly said, "I will never surrender to a traitor," and he shot the man dead from his horse. The other cavalrymen, enraged, began to circle him. From the hospital, his father, Daniel, screamed at him to surrender, to save his own life, but Charles's voice carried back across the field with his final, resolute words, "Father, I can never surrender to a rebel." A moment later, a Confederate shot the 17-year-old in the back. As he staggered, another struck him with the flat of his saber. Daniel McCook managed to reach his son, but the wound was mortal. Charles died in his father's arms. The patriarch then had to place his son's body in a carriage and drive him away from the battlefield himself. Charles's death was more than a family tragedy. It became a public symbol of Union resolve. His defiant last words were told and retold hundreds, possibly thousands of times, transforming the private grief of the McCook family into a powerful narrative of Northern patriotism. For the McCooks, however, it was the first brutal lesson in the true cost of war. And back at Kenyon College, for his brother John James McCook, the news ignited a burning desire to break his promise and avenge the first of the family to fall. While Charles's death was the first blow, the McCook family's involvement in the war was already deep and widespread, spanning nearly every theater and every branch of service. The tribe of Dan, in particular, was filled with professional soldiers and natural leaders who would soon find themselves in the thick of the conflict's most brutal campaigns. The highest ranking of them all was Alexander McDowell McCook. A career soldier and West Point graduate, he was already a veteran of the frontier wars when the conflict began. He would eventually command the 20th Corps of the Union Army, seeing action at Shiloh, Nashville, and at the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky. His career, however, was also marked by controversy. He was one of the generals blamed for the disastrous Union defeat at Chickamauga, and though a court-martial would later find him not guilty of any wrongdoing, the shadow of that battle followed him. A potent symbol of the nation's fractured military leadership can still be seen at the McCook House Museum. One of Alexander's commissions is signed by President Abraham Lincoln, while another from 1854 bears the signature of then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. Other sons from the tribe of Dan were also prominent. Robert Latimer McCook, who was a successful Cincinnati lawyer, raised his own regiment, the 9th Ohio Infantry, largely from the city's German-American population. He proved to be a fierce and beloved commander on the battlefield. His younger brother, Daniel McCook Jr., was also a lawyer and a former partner of a man who would become one of the Union's most famous generals, Ohio's William Tecumseh Sherman. Daniel Jr. was a natural leader who would quickly rise to command a brigade. And yet another brother, Edwin Stanton McCook, was named for his father's friend, the man who would become Lincoln's Secretary of War. He was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy but chose the Army instead. And he also raised a regiment and fought with distinction at Vicksburg and during the Atlanta campaign. The service of their cousins, the tribe of John, was just as dedicated but remarkably diverse, a fact that may well have contributed to their incredible fortune of all surviving the war. While the tribe of Dan was heavily concentrated in the high-risk, high-casualty infantry command, the tribe of John spread its service across different roles. The eldest, Edward McCook, became a dashing cavalry general, famous for reading the Emancipation Proclamation in Tallahassee after securing the Florida capital for the Union. Anson McCook, a lawyer, served two separate enlistments, fighting under both Sherman in Atlanta and Phil Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. His extensive collection of papers, which are now housed at the Library of Congress, form the core of the historical record of the McCooks family service. Roderick McCook was the family's sole naval officer. Before the war, he had commanded ships capturing illegal slavers. During the conflict, he harassed Confederate shipping and commanded a Union ironclad. And two of John's sons, Henry and John James, served as Presbyterian chaplains, tending to the spiritual and physical needs of the soldiers, often under fire but not in direct combat roles. This contrast between the two tribes serves as a powerful metaphor, as I said earlier, for the arbitrary nature of war. It wasn't a question of bravery. All 15 men served with honor, but the specific nature of that service, whether leading an infantry charge or commanding a ship or offering a prayer, often made the difference between life and death. It was a lottery of survival, and for reasons of fate and of circumstance, the tribe of Dan would draw the losing numbers. The summer of 1862 brought a second and in many ways more brutal death to the tribe of Dan. Brigadier General Robert McCook was still recovering from a severe wound he had received at the Battle of Mill Springs in Kentucky. Too weak to ride a horse, he was traveling with his troops in an ambulance as they marched through northern Alabama. On August 6th, while his escort was away, a band of Confederate partisans, led by Captain Frank Gurley, attacked the wagon. Helpless and unarmed in his sickbed, General McCook was shot, and he died within 24 hours. This was not seen as a noble death on the field of honor. To the North, it was murder, an act of guerrilla warfare that violated the unwritten codes of conduct between armies. It reflected the escalating bitterness of the conflict, where the lines between soldier and civilian, between combatant and non-combatant, were beginning to blur. For the McCook family, the news was, as you might expect, devastating. And for Martha McCook, it was the final straw. Realizing she could no longer hold back her youngest son, she finally gave 17-year-old John James her permission to join the Army, to take the place of the brothers that he had lost. Almost a year later, in July 1863, the war came to Ohio. Confederate General John Hunt Morgan led his cavalry on a daring and destructive raid across the state, spreading panic and chaos. The patriarch of the family, Major Daniel McCook Sr., now 65 years old and serving as a Union paymaster, refused to sit idly by. He volunteered to join the militia forces who were pursuing Morgan's raiders. On the 19th of July, 1863, just weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, Union troops finally cornered Morgan's men at Buffington Island as they tried to cross the Ohio River back into West Virginia. In the ensuing battle, Major McCook led an advance party eager to engage the enemy. He was shot, and mortally wounded. He died 2 days later on the 21st of July. In a moment of tragic and poetic symmetry, the patriarch of the Fighting McCooks died on the second anniversary of the day his son Charles was killed at First Bull Run. The deaths of these three members of the tribe of Dan, Charles, Robert, and Daniel Sr., trace a grim arc in the nature of Civil War violence. Charles's death was a conventional but tragic battlefield casualty. Robert's was a brutal guerrilla killing, a sign of a more vicious war, and Daniel Sr.'s death represented the ultimate violation, the war reaching across hundreds of miles to kill a man defending his home soil. The conflict had evolved from a single, distant struggle between armies into an all-encompassing fight where no one and no place was truly safe. By the summer of 1864, the war had become a relentless grind. General William Tecumseh Sherman's Union Army was pushing its way toward the vital Confederate city of Atlanta. But outside Marietta, Georgia, their advance was stalled by a formidable defensive line centered on Kennesaw Mountain. The fighting was brutal, attritional, and fought in thick woods and on steep hills. Frustrated by the slow progress, Sherman, who was a general typically that favored maneuver over direct assault, made a fateful decision. He ordered a frontal attack on the entrenched Confederate positions. To lead one of the main charges against a heavily fortified slope that would become known as Chatham Hill, he selected the brigade commanded by his old friend and former law partner, Colonel Daniel McCook, Jr. On the morning of June 27, 1864, as his men prepared for what many knew was a suicidal charge, Colonel McCook gathered them together. In that tense moment, he did something that would ensure his place in legend. He was a well-read man, and he drew upon the classical education common to his generation. He recited a stanza from Thomas Macaulay's epic poem Horatius, a story of heroic sacrifice for the Roman Republic. His voice rang out over the nervous soldiers. Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate. To every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? By quoting these lines, McCook was doing more than just offering inspiration. He was consciously framing the impending slaughter in the tradition of noble, heroic sacrifice. He was telling his men and telling history that their deaths would not be meaningless, that they would be in a righteous defense of their nation and its ideals. Then he gave the command and led the charge. The assault on Chatham Hill was a vision of hell. One of his soldiers, Sergeant Nixon Stewart, later wrote of the grape and canister, shot and shell that sowed the ground with rugged iron and garnished it with the dead. The Confederate works were formidable, protected by rows of sharpened spikes driven into logs. But McCook was at the forefront. He personally led his men through the storm of lead, and in a moment of incredible bravery, he reached the top of the enemy parapet. Waving his sword, he shouted to his men below, "Come on, boys, the day is won!" And at that very instant of apparent triumph, a Confederate rifleman shot him through the right breast. He fell back, mortally wounded. The attack faltered, beaten back with horrific casualties. Colonel McCook was carried from the field. He lingered for weeks and was transported all the way back home to Ohio. On his deathbed, he was officially promoted to the rank of brigadier general. But when told of the honor, he reportedly dismissed it with the words, "It is too late now." Daniel McCook Jr. died on July 21st, 1864, the third anniversary of the Battle of Bull Run, where his brother had been the first to fall, and the first anniversary of his father's death, just one day before he turned 30 years old. This final heroic act, consciously framed for history, cemented the legend of the Fighting McCooks forever. When the guns finally fell silent in the spring of 1865, the final tally of the McCook family's contribution was staggering. 15 had served. 4 from the tribe of Dan, the patriarch Daniel Sr. and his sons Charles, Robert, and Daniel Jr. were all dead. All 5 sons from the tribe of John had miraculously survived. But the family's story of service didn't end with the war. The survivors continued to dedicate their lives to the nation they had fought to preserve. Anson McCook, the lawyer who had served under Sherman and Sheridan, went on to become a U.S. congressman from New York and later Secretary of the United States Senate. Alexander McCook, the highest ranking of the brothers, continued his career in the regular army. John James McCook, the boy who had promised his mother he would stay at Kenyon, had survived the war after enlisting, returned to finish his degree, and became a prominent New York attorney and railroad executive. Yet violence seemed to stalk the tribe of Dan. Edwin Stanton McCook, who had survived Vicksburg in the March to the Sea, became the governor of Dakota Territory after the war. In 1873, he was assassinated in a political dispute, a final tragic postscript to his family's bloody saga. Today, the legacy of the Fighting McCooks is preserved in the places and papers they left behind. Their family home, not too far down the road from me in Carrollton, Ohio, still stands on the public square. It's now the McCook House Civil War Museum, a historic site that tells their story through the artifacts of their lives. The 5 swords carried by brothers, their father's rifle, the military commissions signed by both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Granite memorials mark the spot where Daniel Jr. fell at Kennesaw Mountain and where his father was mortally wounded at Buffington Island. For a time, a major Army air station in Dayton, McCook Field, bore their name. And for historians, their story lives on in the 6,500 letters, diaries, and documents that make up the McCook family papers at the Library of Congress. They were born leaders, one officer at the time said of them. Such men as would naturally be selected in conflict requiring valor, judgment, and influence with men. They were lawyers, doctors, students, and soldiers who answered a nation's call with a unanimity and a level of sacrifice that remains almost unbelievable. The Fighting McCooks of Ohio were more than just a family of soldiers. They were the embodiment of a nation's will to endure, to fight, and to remain whole, no matter the terrible personal cost. Thanks for listening.